The current official visit by Chinese Premier Li Keqiang will take him to Canberra, Sydney and Auckland for 1 week from March the 22nd to the 29th. It is the most senior visit from a Chinese official since President Xi Jinping's visit to the country in 2014. Premier Li's visit also comes amidst the friction points in Australia's relationship with the United States and from the new American administration and elsewhere. Also, a rising tide of anti-globalization around the world. What main messages does Li's visit deliver to both sides? How is Australia's role in the world changing, and what are the prospects for deeper cooperation with China? Are there special elements in Sino-Australian relations that can defy protectionist trends and open the two economies further to one another? To discuss these topics and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Australia's former Foreign Minister and International Affairs expert, the Honorable Bob Carr. That is our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. But before we get started, let's look at this.
Bob Carr was born in a Sydney suburb in 1947 and became interested in politics in his teenage years. Mr. Carr was first elected to office in 1983. Within 5 years, he assumed the leadership of New South Wales Labour Party after former leader and Premier Barry Unsworth lost the 1988 election. Carr became Premier of New South Wales in 1995. Former New South Wales Labour Premier Neville Wran described Bob Carr as the very model of a modern Labour Premier and a template for other Australian Labour Party leaders. But by 2004, after nearly a decade as Premier, polling showed public support for Mr. Carr falling. He announced his resignation as Premier and member for Maroubra on July 27, 2005. In 2012, Carr joined the Australian Senate and became Minister for Foreign Affairs, replacing Kevin Rudd. He held that office until his resignation in October 2013. In 2014, he accepted the directorship of the newly formed Australia-China Relations Institute of the University of Technology, Sydney, a think tank devoted to studying and enhancing the relationship between China and Australia.
Welcome to that.
Pleasure to be with you, Ray.
What are the issues that are prioritized on the agenda between Premier Li Keqiang and his Australian counterpart? I mean, this visit is the first of its kind since 2 years ago.
I think the relationship has got its own rhythm. It's a very successful, very cordial relationship. I think it's a steady as she goes visit, but if there is a focus, it's on freeing up opportunities for investment on both sides. And I think on the Australian side, making it more possible for Australian investment in China is a priority. But don't forget the context in which this visit is taking place. 1/3 of Australian exports now go to China. And that's a very significant economic dependency and integration between Australia and China.
But how bad is the situation for the bilateral trade since the drop in commodity prices threatened to undermine the bilateral cooperation? And what do you think of the idea of having Belt and Road Initiative as a kind of compensation?
Well, surprisingly, commodity prices have lifted. Against all predictions, commodity prices have bounced back. Australian resource companies, the big ones, Rio, BHP, but also the others, are doing very well at the moment. Commodity prices have gone up. But so too have services, and Australia's earning more from services exports to China, tourism and education, for example, as much from them as we used to get from resources. So the relationship is maturing. I think Australians still want to know what concrete one belt, one road proposals might exist that Australia could become involved in.
What are the major hallmarks for a mature bilateral relationship between two major economies in this Asia-Pacific region?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the dominating fact for Australia and for a lot of China's partners is the successful economic transition that China is undergoing, you look at credible sources like the OECD or the World Bank, and they all confirm that China is going to have a middle class with 860 million more people in it in 2030. Now that is phenomenal. That is literally phenomenal. It's a revolution the like of which we've not seen in the world before, something on this scale. And it means that the opportunities for economic engagement between China and Australia, China and the rest of the world, are going to be hugely enhanced. And Australia's just got to see that it's positioned to take advantage of that. There is no bigger economic prospect for Australia, for my country.
The growing number of the middle class in China does mean big domestic market if we look at the spending-led growth to sustain the Chinese economy. But what does that mean for the Australian economy? Will more of the Chinese travel to your country as tourists? Because so far, the only idea we have got developed about the bilateral economic relationship is more of the Chinese imports about your iron ore and commodities.
Oh, the interesting thing though is that services have grown to figure very big. Tourism, China's our biggest source of tourists. 1 million Chinese tourists a year, with the potential for that to grow dramatically. As more Chinese enter middle class status, more of them are able to sign up for long haul tourism. A flight to Australia becomes viable. Education is another export from Australia to China that is going to grow hugely when China expands its middle class and becomes a predominantly middle class nation. Chinese like the prospect of their young men and women studying at Australian schools and universities. They've got a good reputation, and Australia's got a good reputation for lifestyle, for safety, and is more affordable than American study. So tourism and education are the very big areas. But don't forget, Australian foodstuffs are now being seen more often on the shelves of Chinese supermarkets. And as China lifts another 850 million people into middle class spending power, they're going to be buying their food, their wine in supermarkets, not in village markets. And that's a great opportunity for Australian farmers.
Australia is indeed one of the most popular tourist destinations for the Chinese. Having said this, recently a terrorist attack took place outside the British Parliament. As a member of the British Commonwealth, do you think Australia will be immune from such attacks? And what is it that has made your country boast of a better sense of security for the overseas travellers?
Australia's generally offered a safe environment to visitors. We won't be immune. We won't be immune from terrorist attacks. Our police and our security agencies have intercepted a number of them, but you know the challenge. They've got to win 100% of the time, and a terrorist organisation has only got to be able to break through once. Australia will be subject to terrorist attacks because there are enough extremist groups trying to pull one off.
Given the broad backdrop of rising populism, which means borders are likely to be closed in some of the countries, be it in the European Union or North America, will that happen in your country? Because globalization that so far the Australian government supports, it does mean free movement of human resources. Yeah. And immigration, for example.
Yes.
But do you think Australian politicians will get more conservative and cautious?
No, I think Australians are very proud of being an immigrant nation. Consider this, 28% of the Australian population was born overseas. Now that's a higher percentage than the United States or Canada or any other immigrant nation. That is over a quarter of Australia's population born outside the country. And then you've got the sons and daughters of parents who were born outside Australia. We're very proud of that. It has meant running an immigration policy where we have had to say, if you come by boat, well, that's illegal. You won't be settled in Australia if you come as a result of the work of a people smuggler. And we've had to do that because that was very unsafe. There were people dying at sea. So that option has been closed off, but it means Australia can run a big humanitarian intake. But I can't think of another country that is able to say 28% of our population was born overseas.
Following the Brexit and the campaign success of President Trump, particularly after Donald Trump signed the presidential executive order imposing bans on Muslims from 7 countries, what was the immediate response from lawmakers in your country? Donald Trump also threatened to close the borders by erecting a wall along the border with Mexico. You're a member of the Western democracies and you're a member of the British Commonwealth, so these things happened, and if you put them into one perspective, what does that mean for politicians in Australia?
I think an Australian politician would say that America is entitled to take whatever measures it needs to for its security. It can determine the conditions under which someone can fly into the United States. We wouldn't interfere in their internal affairs, nor would China. China wouldn't criticise decisions about immigration made about America by the American government. But if America goes one step further and makes it harder for bright young students and graduates from its universities to stay in America and work in start-up industries, to work in Silicon Valley, for example, then I've got to say Australia will be very ready to take them. Very ready. You know how young Chinese and young Indians have made a great contribution to America, to the American economy. If it's harder for them to settle in the United States and work and give America the success in technology and innovation that America has enjoyed because of the contribution of migrants, then we will take them. Australia will take them and we'll benefit from all those start-ups and all that innovation.
Okay, Bob, Australia and the United States have been strong allies historically. Yet recently, US President Donald Trump and Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull are said to have had a heated phone conversation in which the United States President argued about the refugee agreement and then abruptly terminated the call with a stinging complaint that it was the worst discussion that he had with the world leader that day. Now, the world was surprised, if not taken aback, by his statement that posted on the Twitter. Has the state of affairs fundamentally changed Australia-US relations?
No, it hasn't. It hasn't. An alliance reflects an assessment of the long-term interest of your country. And most Australians would think that despite their deep reservations about this American president, and Trump is profoundly unpopular in Australia, that it's still in Australia's interest to have an alliance relationship with the US. But I've got to say, Trump's behaviour simply increases the proportion of Australians who think China is more important to our future than the United States. A recent poll showed that when asked the question, China or the US, who's more important to Australia's future, 43% said China, 43% said the US. Now that is striking. That's a striking measure of public opinion in a country that has been so instinctually attached to the United States. And so I think you can take a broad lesson here. Trump's presidency is a great opportunity for China. A great opportunity for China to show global leadership in the spirit of your president's speech in January in Davos.
Despite a press conference that Secretary of Defense James Mattis hosted during his official visit to South Korea and Japan, the 2 close allies in Northeast Asia, at which he said more of the diplomacy is needed in the South China Sea. Yet an American admiral was urging Australians to join patrols in the South China Sea. Now, Premier Li Keqiang said in Australia during the official visit that China does not want to see anyone using Cold War mentality in picking sides. Obviously, he was referring to the South China Sea. Now, some of the Australian observers said they refuse to be lectured by China. What do you think of this spat?
I think there is one standout fact here, and it's this. Three American admirals have suggested over the last 18 months that Australia should run patrols within the 12 nautical mile radius of Chinese claimed territory in the South China Sea. What has Australia done? Australia has not run those patrols. And that to me is a standout fact. So three American admirals have said to Australia, it'd be good if you joined us or ran your own patrols, and Australia's not done it. And that is because the government in Canberra is giving a weighting to its relationship with China. And it's not prepared to damage or immolate that relationship at the request of the US. Now, I think there's an opportunity for China here. I'd strongly advise China not to do anything preemptive in the South China Sea. For example, not to build up Scarborough Shoal, which is so close to the territory of the Philippines, and which both China and the Philippines...
But China says over and over that we will not endanger the freedom of navigation and overflight.
I understand that. I understand that. But if China were to dredge at Scarborough Shoal, and then well, dredging would be enough. I think China would lose the diplomatic coup it scored with the new Philippines president and the relationship it enjoys with him. I think China's now got the nations of Southeast Asia negotiating one-on-one with it over disputes over maritime territory. I think China would be ill-advised were it to do anything at Scarborough Shoal that threatened that new approach, that equilibrium, that new equilibrium in the South China Sea. If I were the Australian Foreign Minister again, I'd be speaking to the Chinese off the record, in private conversations, saying you've gained strategically in the South China Sea. You've got the states of the region talking to you one-on-one directly. America runs freedom of navigation patrols, but they don't alter any of these diplomatic realities. But if one thing would change the situation, it would be China dredging at Scarborough Shoal. So a bit of restraint from China would be in everyone's interest.
But Manila does enjoy a very good relationship with Beijing after the official visit by President Xi. But you are watching Dialogue with Mr. Bob Carr, former Foreign Minister of Australia. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Let's look at some of the uncertainties concerning our bilateral relationship. Australia rejected aligning a $5 billion state infrastructure fund with China's Belt and Road Initiative during our Premier Li Keqiang's Canberra trip, the Financial Times reported. Why has Australia rejected the development of infrastructure cooperation with China? Is it a zero-sum mentality that is ideologically driven?
No, I don't think so. I think the Australian government has got to explain the reasons for the rejection. I think the way of approaching it is to forget the branding, one belt, one road, and to talk about it in a different way, to give it a branding. I think Australian business and Australian government still need to be persuaded that doing something on Australian soil requires being branded as being part of one belt, one road. But I think there are other ways of doing it. And don't forget, there is now a lot of Chinese investment in Australia. It's still only about 3% of the total, but it is growing markedly, and there is a lot of room for more of it, and we expect more of it. We expect more of it. I think the Chinese have found a way of addressing Australian concerns about the loss of sovereignty through the purchase of Australian assets, including prime agricultural land. And that is for Chinese investors to form a consortium with Australian partners and to settle for 50% of the Melbourne ports, or 49% of Australia's biggest rural property.
You see, in the process of globalization, regarding especially merger and acquisition, politicians in whatever trade partners, in countries of whatever partnership, would always cite national security as an excuse to bar some of the deals. And do you think Australia is no exception, using sovereignty to prevent such a transaction, and that would be detrimental to your national interest instead, ironically?
Yeah, I understand the argument, but don't forget that very few proposals have been knocked back. Very few Chinese investment proposals have been knocked back. The most high-profile one was a bid by a Chinese entity, a state-owned corporation, State Grid, to purchase part of the electricity network in Australia.
Mm-hmm. That was rejected, to my knowledge.
Yeah, and on the vague grounds of national interest.
And in 2015, the government of Australia's Northern Territory decided to lease the port of Darwin to Landbridge Group in Chinese Luqiao Jituan, a Chinese company, for 99 years at a price of just over 500 million Australian dollars.
Yeah, so there you've got a countervailing example. There you've got an example of how what some people would describe as a strategic asset was leased to a Chinese owner. And there were critics of that in Australia. And the American government queried it. The American government queried it. And the US Embassy commissioned a poll so they could have an opinion poll to wave around that showed Australians had reservations about it. But it went ahead. It went ahead. It was the Australian government saying there aren't security issues here. Landbridge is entitled to bid to lease this asset, and there you have the port of Darwin being owned by a Chinese entity. Australia offers a very climate for Chinese investment, very, very open. And Chinese corporations are building theme parks, owning uranium and coal mines, throwing up hotels, building residential real estate, into agriculture, owning a share of the biggest farm in Australia. And so I think we should emphasise the positive here. And now Australia is saying, and it came up in talks with the Prime Minister in Canberra, we want to lift the opportunity in the Chinese economy for Australian acquisitions. In banking, for example, we've been saying that China should increase the share of a Chinese bank that can be overseas owned. And I think as the Chinese economy matures, as it loses developing world status and becomes part of the world of middle income, reaching for rich world status, China will do that. I think it's just a matter of timing.
Let's get a little bit philosophical on the bilateral relationship, Bob. We've all been discussing this whenever we met, whenever we did interviews with you. It is a no topic. I'd like to have some new answers or new perspectives, because Australia has long been divided between the West geopolitically and ideologically, and Asia, which is part of the Far East. Now, with the current shift of wealth and influence from the West to the East, and with the rise of the Asian hemisphere, like Kishma Bobani, a scholar in Singapore, said, on many occasions, Australia seems to be more confused as to how to position itself in the process of geopolitical reconfiguration. Now, we've discussed some of the cases here. The joint patrols in South China Sea, or the 2+2 dialogue with your American counterparts. Now you can raise a number of examples to illustrate, on the one hand, you align yourself with the United States as one of the closest allies for years since the end of World War. On the other hand, Premier Li Keqiang says mildly, we do not like the way of picking sides. I mean, that's a pretty mild piece of advice, if not warning, to our Australian friends, what do you think of the long term? What do you think will happen to your policy making?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Australia is adjacent to Asia. We've got an increasingly Asian population. China's our biggest source of migrants, except those years when India is our biggest source of migrant intake. Yet our institutions are European-derived. There's no doubt, as Australians think this through, that our economic future is with the rise of an Asian middle class, overwhelmingly with the colossal success of China's economic transformation. That's our economic future. I think, Ray, politics will take care of itself. As the Australian economy becomes even more enmeshed with the economies of Asia, then Australians will think about the region differently. A lot of this will be determined by the character China assumes as well. If China's character as an international player is cosmopolitan, multilateral, looking for engagement, non-threatening, Australians and others in Asia are going to feel relaxed about engagement with
We've
China.
made it very clear, for example, the policy speech by President Xi Jinping in Davos to safeguard the free trade and the globalization, unlike Donald Trump, who is beating a retreat from globalization.
No, that's why I say the Trump presidency is a golden opportunity for China to provide more global leadership, not less. And the speech by President Xi Jinping in Davos is an example of China rising to that challenge.
Okay, we'll be discussing.
People in Australia who've previously been fiercely pro-American, after the election of Trump, are saying, well, who's offering the leadership now on more free trade, America or China? And it's self-evidently China. Who's offering the leadership on climate change? China is taking climate change seriously. The Trump administration is not. And Australians are absorbing these messages.
Bob, enough is being discussed about our performance in Davos. Let's come back to examine a simple question. How do you expect the Chinese to look at Australia, its image and identity? Are you West or East, or in between? Give me a short answer.
Australia is part of a Western alliance system. That is, we've got a treaty with the United States, and our institutions are European-derived. But we think for this reason, we can be even more interesting and valuable a partner of China's. And I think China feels the same way. I think China thinks Australia is a worthwhile, comprehensive strategic partner because it is part of the Western system. And it's got a lot to offer China because of that.
In asking this question, Bob, do you think we are all victims of the traditional idea of a nation state since 1648, the Westphalian idea? But thank you very much for being with us, Bob. I do appreciate your insightful comments on our bilateral relationship and perhaps the prospects of having a more rosy picture concerning the bilateral trade.
Yeah, Ray, it's been my pleasure to talk to you again. I hope we do it again soon.
Thank you, sir.
Great pleasure.